Good evening, everyone. สวัสดีครับ First of all, Happy New Year. สวัสดีปีใหม่ครับ to everyone. Glad to have all of you here. Today we have more than 80 people. We have 87 in the room. Very impressive. I believe that is mostly due to our global trend topic today on the carbon capture. So let's start. My name is Panit Jesadawaranun. I'm the Vice Chairperson for the technical program. And very happy to be here and see you all face to face. So start with our mission and our vision. So as usual, our mission here is to collect, to share the knowledge, new technology approach in our country for our energy in our country. And our vision here is to see the smile on your face as well. Agenda today, we'll start with our section announcement briefly, and then we will have the presentation from Dr. Samuel. Glad to have you here, all the way from London. And then followed by Q&A and closing remark, and then lucky draw. Section announcement, let's start with the members. So as you could see, it seems that our member going up according to oil price. So now we have 766 total members and 361 student member from 4 chapter. So today I believe we have students with us as well. Can you raise your hand? มีนักเรียนไหมครับ Allow applause for our student, our future. They are our I don't know. Maybe you have to hold it. And of course, hello. So thanks to Ronald, our technician. All right. So our new technician from SPE. So we still have 49 labs. So if you still haven't paid here, please do so. As you know, if you are SPE member, you can join dinner tonight for free. And then if you're not, you have to pay, I think, 1,500 baht, which is a lot cheaper to join SPE. Of course, please also invite your colleague, your friends to join our meeting as well. SPE benefit, I'm not going to go through all of this. I think you know them already. Just another thing to add here is if you join SPE and you select SPE Thailand as your section, then you will receive our news as well, what's going on, our activity here, and then you'll be up to date with our program. And of course, the dinner would not happen without our generous sponsor. Now we have 38 sponsor, very impressive. So may I have applause for our generous sponsor for tonight. And if you want to see your company logo up here, you can contact any of the board members. So board member, can you raise your hand? Okay, we try to sit different area in the room. So reach any one of us, and then we can collect your money. Okay. Without further ado, let me have คุณเกษียณ สินทุวงศ์ our boss and our chairperson for this program to give the speaker introduction. ขอบคุณครับ
Okay, ขอบคุณครับคุณพนิษฐ์ Oh, lots of people today. Very happy. So, first of all, Happy New Year. We haven't seen each other for over a month because our last meeting was in November. So this is the first meeting of this year. Kicks off with the distinguished lecturers that we got from the SPE assigned to us. He fly all the way from the UK. And every month from now on, we have a very, very interesting program going. Kun Panit will tell you later what's happening next month. And we will also have a very similar to last year, right? The big meeting, which is the season opening to be held in September. So stay tuned for that. So for this meeting, let me introduce our speaker for this evening. Our speaker is the reader at Imperial College, London, where he leads subsurface CO2 groups and is the faculty advisor for the SPE student chapters. He develops digital rock techniques to characterize CO2 storage underground with over 70 highly cited papers. He manages over 10 million pounds in industry and government-funded research. He received his BSc, MSc, and PhD from Columbia University and was a postdoctoral scholar in energy resource engineering at Stanford University. Ladies and gentlemen, please a warm welcome for Mr. Samuel Krevor, our distinguished lecturer for tonight.
Okay, well, thanks for that. This is working now, right? Okay, great. Well, thanks for that kind introduction. And thanks very much to you all for coming to my talk. Thanks very much for the invitation. It's really, really fantastic to be here. I understand this is the most active SPE chapter in Asia, and by my experience touring around the world, it may be a contender for a much larger geographic area than that. So congratulations to you all. So I have to start the talk acknowledging the funding sources for this really excellent program. We've got some folks in the back asking for a volume increase. Okay, hopefully that's better. So the SPE Distinguished Lecturer Program is funded by the SPE Foundation through member donations from you all and a contribution from offshore Europe. And the SPE is also grateful to the companies and Imperial College, in my case, allowing us to take this time to serve as lecturers, and additional support is provided by the AIME. So my talk is called From Digital Rocks to Gigaton Scale CO2 Storage. And at first glance, these two topics may not seem to have very much to do with each other. Digital rocks exists at a size scale which is very small. We are talking about technology that allows us to image and simulate fluid flow through the very pores of rocks. Whereas gigatons of carbon dioxide storage, I'm showing here a graph on the right of just increasing use of carbon capture and storage over time. Gigatons being stored underground. This is
not a technician.
We call them now.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So sorry if I'll try to speak very closely to the microphone. Is that better? Yeah. Okay. Great. So whereas gigatons of carbon storage, this is what the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change say is needed by mid-century to be happening every year to enable us to achieve climate change mitigation, to keep the level of warming to less than 2 degrees C, less than 1.5 degrees Celsius. Gigatons of carbon storage every year is as much fluid handling as the entire oil and gas industry handles today. So these are very disparate scales. However, they have a couple of themes in common. Firstly, both of these technologies have grown up together. Digital rocks emerged in the 1990s as technology enabled the imaging and the modeling that we now know to comprise digital rocks. And carbon storage emerged at the same time when there was increasing interest in climate change mitigation. And as a result of their emerging at the same time, they're intimately linked with each other. Digital rock techniques have been developed in service of carbon storage. Carbon storage has been advanced as a result of advances in digital rocks. So these technologies have really developed not just at the same time, but together in their disciplines. The other theme, which is a bit more abstract, is that both of these areas are beset by problems with visualization. It's difficult to see. So petroleum engineering has, for over 100 years, developed models and theories of increasing complexity to deal with the issue that for a long time we just couldn't see what was happening inside the pores of rocks. And digital rocks has really unlocked that. And I'll show some of the use of that today. Similarly, carbon storage, achieving it at gigaton scale looks the gap between where we are today, exemplified by these blue dots, and where we need to be to avoid climate change is very difficult to see how we get there. So I'll address both of these throughout the talk. So we'll start at the small scale. With digital rocks, technology has enabled this. I'm showing some of the state-of-the-art in imaging technology. This is X-ray light emerging from an X-ray source, a very bright source at a synchrotron light source. And the X-ray light is so bright in this situation that we can image rock cores. So I'm showing a core holder here on the right that has a miniature rock core. It's about 5 millimeters in diameter and 20 millimeters long. And we can image the entire rock core every few seconds. And in this case, we're doing this while we're injecting fluid. We're interested in carbon storage. We're using nitrogen gas as an analog for carbon dioxide to make the physics simpler. And what you'll see are videos of the nitrogen and water moving through the very pores of the rock. This has really only become available in the last few years. So here's one of the images. This is about a cubic millimeter in size. In the blue and green, I'm just visualizing the nitrogen, but there's a co-injection happening here. This is macroscopically steady state flow of nitrogen and water through the rock. This is the type of flow that underpins the theory of relative permeability. So the use of Darcy's law. And when we got time at the synchrotron, we decided to perform experiments in application to CO2 storage that we thought were going to be the simplest experiments that we could see, although of interest. We just wanted to see steady state co-injection because of its association with Darcy's law. And the theory and the conventional wisdom has said for a very long time that as nitrogen and water flow through the pores of the rocks, the interfaces should be stable. You shouldn't see fluctuations in the pathways being taken for the fluids to move. But for the first time looking at this process in real time, you can see that the story is much more complicated. The nitrogen is moving from left to right, and sometimes it's moving through this pore, sometimes there are connections. In the lower right-hand side, we have a very intermittent fluid flow. So this was a big issue, because suddenly all of the assumptions that went into Darcy's law for field-scale modeling of multi-phase flow weren't holding up with this very simple operation. We needed to see, okay, what is the parameter space over which this happens? When might this be applicable in the subsurface? So we carried out a large number of experiments across a range of flow rates, fluid viscosities, fluid interfacial tensions. Here I'm showing the points on a graph of capillary number, which includes those properties, and mobility, which is just the ratio of the fluid viscosities. And the points on the graph show where we've performed experiments and where they're applicable to different fluid systems. So carbon dioxide storage, natural gas production in the lower left-hand corner. And this is the area where we saw the intermittent flow. And when we carried out experiments related to medium crude oils, related to heavy oils, we no longer saw it. And the conventional wisdom held. So it made sense that people hadn't really seen this or worried about it in the past much. However, we identified that it was going to be really important to understand the impacts on fluid flow for carbon storage. So we had to ask the question, well, we know when this happens. We had to ask the question, why does this happen? What are the physics? It didn't make sense to us because a constant fluid flow is less energy intensive than an always fluctuating fluid system. So for this, we didn't really know where to look. But we got lucky. So we carried out more exploratory experiments. In this case, we used a heterogeneous rock. This is a much larger domain. This is tens of cubic millimeters. You can see the 1 millimeter scale bar here. And again, we're showing the pore space in a kind of transparent gray. And this is co-injection, but with nitrogen. And it's not steady state. This is when the nitrogen first invades the pore space. And I'm visualizing the nitrogen in red. And what happens in the system is it's heterogeneous, the nitrogen invades, and then it gets held up at a constriction. None of the fluid can flow. And finally, it breaks through at a single pore in the system, and then all of the fluid flows through that, even as it achieves steady state. So I'll explain in a moment why this was lucky. So I'm showing here a visualization of that nitrogen once it achieves steady state. You can see not much changes after that breakthrough, and it achieves steady state. So what happened in this situation is because we saw all of the fluid flowing through a single pore, we could calculate something called the Reynolds number. And this number tells you something about the nature of the fluid flow. So in addition to connected pathway flow, Darcy's law, or relative permeability, is also dependent on the fluid flow being what is called laminar. So essentially calm, or the extreme other end of the fluid flow spectrum is turbulent. So it's dependent on the system not being turbulent. And the Reynolds number tells you if it's in the laminar regime, if it's in the turbulent regime, if it's somewhere in between. When we calculated the number for the fluid flowing through this little constriction, and it depends on the size of that constriction, that's why we could estimate it in this location, we saw the number was really high for fluid flow. You'd expect a number much less than 1 for fluid flow through the pore space, at least for laminar flow. And what this told us is that in this circumstance, the fluid flowing through this location was not laminar. So it was a little bit more energy intensive. It wasn't quite turbulent, but it was on its way there. So in this circumstance, we kept the co-injection happening after we achieved steady state, but then we ramped up the flow rate by a factor of 4, by a factor of 7. And I'm also visualizing the connectivity of the fluid blob. So all of the fluid in a single color is connected to itself. And as we increase the flow rate, you see two things. Firstly, the connectivity of the fluid is now broken. There are a lot of isolated fluid blobs, at least as far as we can see in the imagery. And you also see that the nitrogen is able to invade much more of the pore space. And as we increase the flow rate again, it happens even more so. So the fluid is flowing while we took these images, but it looks disconnected in our imagery. And what that means is that there is this intermittent flow that we saw a few slides ago that's making the connection. The fluid has to be flowing through because we're doing it. We see it come out the end. And what we see happening is that intermittency is emerging as a way for the fluid to flow rather than taking the very energy-intensive pathway that we see in the first case. So suddenly, we had a physical explanation for what was going on. The choice that the fluid had was either to move through a very energy-intensive pathway or to use intermittency and expand the pore network that it was moving through. So we understand when this intermittency happens. We now understand why it happens. And in principle, we have everything in place to tell us what is the impact? When is this important? For that, we've really just begun. I have a few data points here to share with you, where we've estimated the impact on the relative permeability, essentially the mobility of the carbon dioxide as it's flowing through the reservoir. And one thing we see is that when we looked at the intermittency during the unsteady state, the initial displacement of that nitrogen coming through versus the steady state setup, we see much more intermittency in that initial stage. The mobility, the relative permeability we measure at the same time was also much higher. So that means that this intermittency gives rise to a more mobile system. We can see how many pore volumes, or we control how many pore volumes we inject as the intermittency relaxes into a steady state system, now just facilitating those connections between the locations, and the mobility decreased. And what that means is for a CO2 plume, for example, initially injected, the leading edge of the plume is going to be much more mobile. So these are some of the impacts that we're seeing at the field scale emerging from what was really surprising exploratory results using these new tools. So that's one story of one example of a case in which digital rock technologies have come together and allowed us to discover something new about the physics, which is having an impact at the field scale. But there are a huge number of areas where this is happening. So I'm highlighting here other applications that have emerged. And what I want to emphasize here is that these are practical applications. These can be used, and in some cases are being used, embedded into industry workflows for characterization and modeling. So I've already talked about pore scale fluid dynamics, but we can now control and identify the mechanisms that allow low salinity flooding to result in enhanced oil production, for example. This has given rise to screening criteria that allow us for the first time to characterize rocks and tell you if a low salinity flood is going to be successful or not. We can characterize the mineral distributions and reactive surface area of rocks in reactive systems like with carbon storage, but in many others. This has been the keystone to unlock accurate predictions of reactive transport processes. We can characterize the wetting state distribution within the pores of rocks. So the colors here I'm showing there are pore space visualized and colored depending on their wetting state, from an oil wet state to a water wet state. This is, again, unlocking the ability of digital rock physics to characterize a pore space and enable predictions of flow properties like capillary pressure and relative permeability. All of these things are possible and, in many cases, being used today. But this comes back, again, to the ever-present question of when does this matter? All of these new techniques, the discovery of new physics, getting us to the laboratory door, so to speak, getting us new petrophysical properties, but do these small-scale features have an impact on flow at the field scale? Because if not, it's just an academic exercise, really. So here I'm showing carbon dioxide storage as I'm going to be discussing it in this talk, but also I like to emphasize that this is carbon storage as it's being deployed today. Industrially around the world, there are around 30 projects actively injecting carbon dioxide into structural closures, into oil fields, and using that with enhanced oil recovery. And now, even in injecting into sites where there's no proximate structural trap, and that are relying on properties like the residual trapping of the reservoir to immobilize the plume. So this is demonstrated in all of these different geological settings. Our interest, and the application I'm going to talk about right now, is can we characterize a reservoir and forecast plume migration, and can we understand it after we see it happening? So this has become a big conundrum for carbon storage, actually. I'm showing here now modeling efforts from probably the most well-known carbon storage project in the world, the Sleipner project. It started in 1996. And what you see here is a plan view looking down at, in white, the outline of the plume as it's observed with 3D seismic. And in the colored squares, I'm showing the best efforts, in this case, a group from the British Geological Survey, but using conventional reservoir simulation workflows to history match the plume. And you can see there are a number of really important features. These are kilometer scale features that can't be captured even after these really high quality observations have been used and a strenuous history matching exercise has been executed. This has been tried out by a large number of groups using models of ever-increasing sophistication, essentially pointing to the role of heterogeneity in the reservoir as the culprit, but not quite bridging the gap to the point where the system can be simulated. This isn't only observed at Sleipner. Almost every project that you can find information about monitoring the carbon dioxide plume observes a similar phenomena. Here's the Insula project in Algeria, where plume migration resulted in breakthrough at an observation well much sooner than expected. Here's a data set just released by the Decatur project in the United States. This is operated by Archer Daniels Midland. Here again is the outline of the plume in red. And in the orange and yellow are the best efforts at history matching. In fact, in this case, they went even farther. They said, we just can't match the plume using anything we've observed in the reservoir. So we're just going to add things like a bounding fault or an impermeable barrier that we know doesn't exist. And they still can't do it. Here's a project that was led by the US Department of Energy, a pilot scientific project where the system was really highly instrumented. Everything that could be observed was observed. There's a gravity migration and a much smaller injection of thousands of tons of carbon dioxide, but the breakthrough again of the plume at the observation well happened much sooner than expected. Closer to where we are at the moment, the Otway Stage 3 project ongoing. This is a very homogeneous reservoir. And for reasons that aren't really explained at the moment, you see this strong southeasterly trend in the plume. Any effort at reservoir simulation that doesn't invoke things that aren't in the reservoir sees a very symmetrical plume spreading out from the injection point. So what this means is that there's something about the physics that's missing in the workflow, in the simulation, and the obvious culprit, again, is reservoir heterogeneity. But these history matches have tried using the conventional approach. And in fact, since the 1970s, we've been able to characterize heterogeneity in some of the properties and regularly do so all the way down to the laboratory scale. So it is possible. Since medical X-ray CT was invented, it was almost immediately used in petrophysical studies alongside the medical applications. Here's an example of porosity imaged in 3 dimensions. Again, this is a very mature technology. But what has been missing is not a characterization of heterogeneity in porosity and permeability, but a characterization of heterogeneity in multi-phase flow properties. So I have one of the only equations in the entire presentation, and we won't go through this in great detail. I've tried to keep it up. But what I've done is I've created what's called the pressure equation. You don't have to understand it too closely, but know that this is really the underpinning of most reservoir simulation technology. And I've organized terms to describe the movement of carbon dioxide in response to what's often referred to in the petroleum engineering literature as forces, so 3 forces. There's a pressure drive, and that usually in carbon dioxide storage comes from the injection well. You inject, it creates high pressure at the injection well, it pushes the CO2 away. There's a buoyancy drive. Carbon dioxide's lighter than water, and it typically migrates upwards in a reservoir. That's the 3rd term. And the middle term is the one that's often ignored. And that's a drive that comes from heterogeneity or gradient in the capillary pressure in the system. And there's good reason to ignore it. When you run a scaling analysis, what you find is that if you're thinking about fluid flow over length scales that are larger than a few meters, for various reasons, the capillary pressure drive won't work. It's what's known as a diffusive force. It means that it can be very potent over small scales, but over a few meters or larger, it would take ages to use a capillary pressure gradient to move carbon dioxide. So at the field scale, certainly, you can ignore it. Sometimes you can ignore buoyancy, and sometimes that's done, but it's regularly included. Okay. But here is what is missed when you follow that line of thinking. It's not wrong, but it misses something. If we only consider this very small scale, the laboratory scale essentially, centimeters to meters, you can think of this as a rock core. And I'm showing a schematic here with a very simple heterogeneity. There's two layers, and one layer, the first layer here, is more permeable. And what that means is the capillary pressure curve is lower. It has a lower entry pressure. And the second layer is less permeable. It's easier for fluid to move through, and that means the entry pressure of that curve, the capillary pressure curve, is higher. So usually, when we characterize rocks in the lab and when we perform reservoir simulation, we average over size scales of this length. And it means that if we had a saturation, an average saturation in the rock core or in our simulator, the two fluids would have whatever the average saturation was, and it would map to a typically low mobility on the relative permeability curve, because both are controlled by saturation. So I sum up those two mobilities, I've got this red curve here. However, in reality, what happens is the carbon dioxide moves through the high permeability layer because there's a low entry pressure. This is a multi-phase flow effect. And as a result, it has high saturation of carbon dioxide. And as a result, the relative permeability of carbon dioxide in that layer is very high. And even if you account for the fact that it's moving through less room, the mobility of the carbon dioxide is much, much higher than it would be if you assume the average. In fact, the same happens for the water. The water preferentially moves to the low permeability layer, high saturation, high relative permeability. The overall impact is the total mobility of the fluid in the system is much, much higher than you'd anticipate using the conventional workflow. So we know there's potential for this effect. And that's what that scaling argument has missed. I would say I can't lay the blame entirely at the hands of the theory and the modeling folks. It's also almost certainly driven by the experimental folks as well. Because until recently, until a lot of techniques in digital rocks had been developed, we didn't have any way to measure heterogeneity in the multi-phase flow properties at this scale. So here, I'm showing a new approach that has been developed over the last 5 years, 10 years, where we've unlocked this issue. I'm showing here an experiment where we've co-injected nitrogen and water again. Again, we use nitrogen a lot as an analog for CO2. And you just see the fluid distribution, the saturation distribution of nitrogen. That's not new. That's something that's been done again in SCAL since the 1970s. But what we can do is we can take an image like that now and use the saturation distribution to infer the heterogeneity in the capillary pressure characteristics. We can map this directly to heterogeneity in the multi-phase flow properties. Here's the result of our approach in terms of the nitrogen saturation. We've created a simulation which history matches this observation, and you can see the saturation distribution is really similar, qualitatively at least. It's also similar quantitatively. So when we just graph the experimental saturation against the simulated saturation, you see that they fall by and large on the one-to-one line. I'm also showing experimental uncertainty here, so the points are approaching the experimental uncertainty. By the way, you wouldn't want them to do much better, or else you'd have what's called an overdetermined system. You'd know you were matching for the wrong reasons. So we can match the saturation. We do that by history matching, and we infer the multi-phase flow properties in that way. And what's our validation is to predict then, using the simulation, an experiment that we perform at a different condition. So I'll show the results of that prediction here. So the inputs to the simulation obtained from our experiments are the black relative permeability curves, and those are parameterized by the black points. And our prediction from the simulation is the blue dashed curve. And that's put up against, compared to the experiments completely independently done shown with the blue crosses. So our parameterization of multi-phase flow heterogeneity in this system is producing a physically realistic model. And it validates that we're actually inferring the actual heterogeneity in multi-phase flow properties at centimeter scales, just as we need to model plume migration at larger scales. We've done this a lot. So here are different rocks with different types of heterogeneities. Suffice it to say that depending on the heterogeneity, the impacts are very, very different. It's difficult to predict what that is, so using this characterization workflow is important if you want to incorporate the impacts of these small heterogeneities in your simulation. We're not just leaving it in the laboratory. So I think it's our responsibility to bring it to the field scale, show the use and the value of this. We're evaluating, in the example I'll go through right now, plume migration at the endurance field. We're also evaluating plume migration at another site, and I'll show you the results of that later on. And much of this is enabled by the availability of data. So carbon storage has come with a wealth of information. It seems that the industry right now is really open to sharing information, and I think it's also probably arising from governments requiring information to be shared when they fund demonstration projects. In any event, all of this information is publicly available, and that's why we have access to it. Here, the storage site is a reservoir in the southern North Sea. It's the Bunter Sandstone. There's been a characterization well drilled. The injection is actually going to be down dip of the peak of the closure. And what the operators of this project would really like to know is how quickly the carbon dioxide is going to migrate to that peak, because they're going to see it happen. That will allow them to characterize the reservoir even more closely. And they'd also like to know if there's any chance that this migrates beyond and is pushed beyond the spill point of this system before expected. So we take the measurements that I walked through just a few slides ago, and we also include all of the richness of information that we have from well logs, petrophysical studies, a full industry characterization of this site, and we incorporate that into very high resolution simulations. So this is 5 meters by 10 meters, essentially resolved at the centimeter scale, not because this is what you need to do to characterize your reservoir in this way, but we needed to do it to validate the approach, to show that it was important. So the simulation results I'm about to show you were really performed at the centimeter scale based on all of these observations in our own in the laboratory. So here are some box models. We carry out simulations on a huge number of realizations with models that honor the statistics of the heterogeneity that we characterized. And here are the results. So CO2 injection in these box models is from left to right, and all we're doing is comparing two models that have all of the same properties. And our second model is heterogeneous in permeability and porosity, and it has capillary pressure. It's just not heterogeneous in capillary pressure. So that's the only thing that we're changing. And we're just looking at CO2 breakthrough. And CO2 breakthrough happens first in the heterogeneous model where we've included our characterization, and it happens 2 times later in the model where we didn't include our characterization. We carry out these simulations over and over again. We change the length of the layers essentially. And we see that after the correlation length, so the length of the layer compared to the width of the layer, the height of the layer, is greater than 2, the comparison between the red and the blue dots here is about a factor of 2. And that means the plume is migrating 2 times faster when we incorporate this characterization than when we don't. And that's just in this small model. Okay, at the Captain, at another field, in the Goldeneye field in the Captain Sandstone in the central North Sea, we've carried this all the way to the field scale. We used those simulations as the basis for a relatively straightforward upscaling workflow. It's not the most widely used, but it's certainly straightforward to implement. So it's nothing that people can't use today. So we inject CO2 from the bottom of fields, and again, we're comparing two models in which all of the properties are the same except for the heterogeneity and the capillary pressure function. So the first thing you'll see is the carbon dioxide migrating from the bottom of the homogeneous system gets to the top of the reservoir. And the heterogeneous system, it's baffled and trapped by these heterogeneities. That's a really positive outcome, actually. But the other feature you'll see is the one that I was talking about. Even though the heterogeneous plume got to the top of the reservoir much, much later, it moves so quickly in a lateral sense that it actually catches up to the plume in the homogeneous system. So I should emphasize that the grid blocks in this simulation are really large. Or just conventionally large, 10 meters in height, 50 or 60 meters in length. So these heterogeneities in the simulation are not centimeter scale, but they're incorporating the impacts of the centimeter scale heterogeneity through our upscaling workflow. So all of this is to say that digital rocks techniques are unlocking a huge number of applications today. With CO2 storage, we already see a very clear-cut case for a need to use these techniques to characterize fluid flow so that the dynamics that we see at the field scale can be captured. So the second part of my talk is going to a much, much larger scale. Gigatons of carbon dioxide storage underground. I'm showing here, again, the graph that came from the first slide of CO2 storage in terms of injection rate per year over time. And the blue dots show around where we are today. So we have around 30 projects. The capture, what's called the capture capacity of those projects is around 40 million tons per year. Whereas assessments of climate change mitigation show time and time again that by 2050, mid-century, we may need as much as 10 gigatons, 10,000 million tons per year. And again, that's as large as the current oil and gas industry is today. If you look at simply the growth in the industry required, the annual growth required to get from here to there, it's astronomical. In fact, 20% annually for the next 30 years is probably unrealistic. They're implausible. So I mentioned at the very start of the talk, there's difficulty here. There's something going wrong. We can't see this. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about where do these models come from? And what is it that we can contribute from the subsurface community? Because on the one hand, CCS as an early technology is a success. On the other hand, it's all but impossible to see how it's going to fulfill this particular role. So firstly, the first piece of information that I found it difficult to find was, well, those blue dots showing current progress were in terms of something called capture capacity. That sounds like a potential. I didn't know what it meant. And I looked into what it meant, and it means something different for nearly every single CCS project. And for all of them, it doesn't mean how much is actually being stored. So I had to spend some time figuring out how much CO2 is actually being stored today. And you can find this reported by and large for almost every project that is operating with varying degrees of legal assurance, from government reporting to corporate sustainability reports, and then all the way down to press releases. In fact, over 90% of the CO2 storage is reported in these first two categories. And just compiling that information, what we found here, you can see the list of projects that you can find publicly available information for. The capture rate capacity in 2019, for example, 36 million tons per year. And the storage rate, all publicly reported by these companies in some form or another, most of them with a high degree of legal assurance associated, 29 million tons that year. So that's pretty good. 80% of something called the capture capacity. That's pretty good performance in my book, and indicative of a success story. So what is happening with these models that project tens of gigatons of storage per year? We looked at how these models were representing CO2 storage, and here's a list of models, and these columns tell you about how they're representing CO2 storage. And you can see a lot of no's, which essentially mean that they're not representing it in any sort of physically meaningful way, and unlimited, meaning that they're just allowing as much CO2 storage to happen as is demanded by other aspects of the models. And there are a few numbers, and when these numbers have been included in the models, they come from a report published in 1994 that estimated the distribution of CO2 storage resources around the world. It was a great estimate at that time, but we have been involved in a huge number of studies since then, study after study after study, assessing CO2 storage resources all over the world. I've compiled all of the green dots on this graph represent a resource assessment of some form or another. A huge number of studies, really well done, high quality information. So firstly, that table needs to be updated. But beyond that, we were asking, well, how should this information be used? Should you just get a number for the CO2 storage capacity of a region, put it in the model, and if you hit that number, you stop using CO2 storage? We looked at the uncertainty in those estimates. So the vertical columns here, you can see, are all dots for a single location, ranging in size from left to right from a single field to a whole regional system like the Utsira or the Basal Cambrian sandstone. And irrespective of the size, what you see is an uncertainty that ranges 1.5 to 2 orders of magnitude in these resource assessments. So even if we wanted to include a single number, they would be highly uncertain. And this is more or less irreducible. It's not indicative of the quality of these studies. These are very good studies. But what's going on is that we're at a point with CO2 storage, we're very interested to know the capacity, and it's very similar to what was happening in the 1930s, the 1940s, when geologists, engineers, companies became very interested in how much oil in total could be produced. And there was a very vigorous discussion. Here's a New York Times article about a debate that took place at the United Nations in New York. But what ultimately emerged was it was important not just to assess the total resources, but to incorporate information about how those resources would be used. And from that emerged an entire discipline known as growth modeling. So here I show the growth in oil production in the Middle East. And this is fit with what looks like a normal curve, but it's something known as a logistic curve. And time again, not just with oil, but with nearly every natural resource that has been used, the initial phase of growth, this is what we're interested in with CO2 storage, followed a pattern. And that pattern was essentially exponential at the beginning. And then after about 20% of the assessed resource was used, it started to slow down. So these curves also decline, but historically, what typically happens is technology intervenes and production continues in a kind of haphazard way after that. But what this means is that these models could link early growth and the onset of decline to the total resource base. So why shouldn't we use this for CO2 storage? And that's what we've done. So I'm showing the same graph, except here on a logarithmic plot. And all I'm showing is that the slope of this graph, how quickly we can scale up CO2 storage, should be linked in our models to the ultimate resource base that has been assessed. It's a very simple model. It's a 3-parameter model in this case. But these are the types of trajectories that can tell us about what is plausible for the near term or at least to mid-century scale up for CO2 storage. If you recast that information, what you see implicit in the models is that there's a trade-off between the rate of growth, that initial slope, and the total amount of storage resource. And this is a really useful model to have, because firstly it's simple, it's only 3 parameters, but it links, again, the geology, the storage resource base, to techno-economic factors. What drives growth? What are the incentives? What are the inhibitors? All of that is embedded in the information on the horizontal axis. So if we have trajectories that we can plot in this envelope, what you find is that if the plans fall in this pink region, for example, the growth rate implied by the plans is really demanding. It's too high. It's implausible. Whereas if the points follow in the yellow part of the graph, it means that they're resource limited. They're going to put a strain. It's going to be difficult to achieve these trajectories given the resource base. So I liken it to filling up a cup with water. You can't pour at the same rate if you want to get the cup filled to the brim. At some point, you have to slow down. And that's a similar thing that's happening if points fall in this part of the graph. Now, if we look at the global storage deployment in the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change plans, by 2100, they're talking about a cumulative storage of 350 to 1280 gigatons. So this is one form of what I was showing much earlier. So in terms of cumulative storage to 2100, and again, this is what matters for climate change mitigation. Actually, the trajectory we're on, 7% growth or 8.6% growth, depending on what measure you're using, gets us beyond many of the trajectories that achieve safe levels of climate change. It's possible to achieve the most ambitious efforts if we increase the growth rate, if we incentivize the deployment of CO2 storage above what we see today. If we recast this on our trade-off graph, we can also put an upper limit on the total global storage resource required for the most ambitious plans, and we can see it's around 2,700 gigatons. That's the most we'll ever need for these sky-high estimates of CO2 storage deployment. And that's a factor of 3 to 10 times less than what these resource assessments say we have. So I think there has been there's been a view for a while that we have an abundance of resource, but now we can actually quantify it. And we say, well, let's stop assessing just how much we can store and focus now on what we need to enable our plans. We can apply this regionally. So here are storage resources evaluated for Europe, alongside numbers showing deployment plans for the European Union, for the United Kingdom. And I'll focus in on the storage resources offshore Norway and UK alone, because the political situation is such that onshore storage in Europe is probably not going to happen. All of those plans are points on this trade-off graph. And what you see is that if we consider the combined resources of the UK and Norway, 172 gigatons, that all of the plans can be achieved. But the rates of growth implied by those plans are really high. They're all above 10%. So 11%, all the way up to 17% annual growth sustained for the next 25 years. But of interest is that if we only consider a fraction of those resources, the plans are still available. If we restrict ourselves to 10% of those resources or only look at the resources of the UK or Norway alone, and what that means is that we're sure that we have the resources available. Moreover, all of the demand from Europe can be serviced by the storage resources of either the UK or Norway alone, even with the uncertainty. So we can put numbers to these things. We've performed a similar analysis for America. We've come up with additionally interesting conclusions. All of the demand from different plans, whether from the US government or reports from universities or think tanks, can be achieved. In this case, of interest is that the Gulf Coast United States could accommodate all of the storage demand from all of the United States. So once we start looking into the deployment of CO2 storage from the perspective of subsurface resource use and our experience in the oil and gas industry in particular, we get many more positive stories. And I'd like to end with this slide. because I think it shows one of the most positive stories of all. So this comes back to our study where we were just estimating how much CO2 had been stored, or compiling information about how much CO2 had been stored to date. Starting with 1996, this is a logarithmic graph. This is just the time series of storage from all of these projects. Accumulating all of these means that we've stored over 200 million tons of CO2 to date. And I think we all know that CO2 storage hasn't had the strongest incentives or very consistent incentives. But when you look at if you look at the climate change mitigation of CO2 storage, whether 200 million tons or 30 million tons stored in 2019, even across these 30 projects alone, it's having the same impact as half of solar photovoltaic deployment in America. So the deployment of CCS in a huge range of geological settings, industrial settings, already having the impact of renewable energy technologies today, shows you that it's a success story, and it shows you the potential. I've gone through all of these, and I'll come back to the summary at the end, so we can leave this up here. I'd like to acknowledge the many, many researchers and collaborators who I've had the pleasure of working with on this work, and our sponsors for this research. I've provided a lot of references. Happy to email any of you any of these. If you can't access them, just send me an email. And it's really important that you provide feedback. So if you could all just visit the Distinguished Lecturer Evaluation Contest and make sure you submit your evaluations, that's really important for the SPE for me. I get that feedback in real time, not quite real time, maybe in a week or so, and it's used to improve the presentation. So with that, I'll close. Thank you, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Samuel. Any question from the floor?
Thank you. That's brilliant. How does this apply to other gases like methane?
Yeah, so I think you're probably alluding to the heterogeneity issue and the plume migration. Yeah, so it's the answer. We haven't studied it nearly as much as CO2 storage, but the answer is that it applies in exactly the same way. So it will apply for natural gas. Will apply for hydrogen to hydrogen storage, and we're now just beginning some collaborations with industry who think they see manifestations of this in their fields.
Any other questions?
Go ahead. You might have to excuse my ignorance, not a reservoir engineer, but you mentioned a few times about multi-phase modeling and CO2 for those projects that you mentioned. Anything over 73 bar would be supercritical fluid. Is it because you are considering with water, or what do you consider multi-phase fluid for modeling?
Yes, so carbon dioxide is soluble in water, but not very much. So if you have perfectly fresh water, at reservoir conditions, the most carbon dioxide you can get into the water dissolved is around 5% by weight of the water. So in practice, what that means is, in the reservoir, carbon dioxide doesn't flow very quickly, actually. Meters per day for an engineered system, maybe up to 10 meters a day near the injection point. And what that means is the water that the carbon dioxide is coming in contact with equilibrates very quickly with the carbon dioxide. So by and large, and this has been demonstrated time and time again in various ways, all the way up to the field setting, you can model it as an immiscible multi-phase system. So with gas injection into oil fields, of course, then you have to you don't want the immiscible phase. So there, it's a completely different story. But this is for carbon dioxide water systems.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for a very interesting presentation. Really enjoyed it. Just two questions actually. So you mentioned about the heterogeneity. I mean, the capillary heterogeneity in the finer scale. So in any of the simulation software, the conventional simulation softwares are taking this up?
Yes. So firstly, it's possible to do this, and we have carried this workflow out using CMG, using Eclipse, using open source simulation software. And so it's possible, perfectly possible to do this with any commercial reservoir simulation software. One thing that we're doing now to make this more widely accessible to industry is we're building tools, for example, just a rote tool to carry out the upscaling algorithm to create the pseudo-relative permeabilities that incorporate this heterogeneity. So our first step with this is we're working with a software company called OpenGoSim, and they're really UK based, and they don't have their own software, but they provide a commercial support system for an open source software called pFlowTran. That's their business model, and we're working with them to incorporate that, and a few companies are involved with that, BP, Shell, and we're hoping that as once they start showing people that they're using it, this then becomes more widely used. And we're doing this in a way that there won't be any barriers to its use. So there's not really any protection on the use of this workflow. We're just trying to demonstrate A, its importance, and B, the practicality of doing it.
Thanks. Is there any place where I can find more information about it?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to send you a few links
I'll drop
to the project and things like that. Yeah.
Thanks. The second question is actually with the storage estimation you have put it. So most of these are in aquifers, or they also include the depleted oil and gas reservoir?
So actually, over 90% of CO2 storage at the moment is with enhanced oil recovery. So you have to see the financial incentives in the U.S. for using enhanced oil recovery, where all of the infrastructure and experience is there, is so high that as long as it's allowed, if you have the carbon dioxide and you're going to inject it underground, there's no reason not to use it with enhanced oil. It's just essentially either you get the revenue or you don't, right? And so, but there are a number of places in Canada, I've heard, they're making it difficult for enhanced oil recovery to qualify as CO2 storage. In Europe, there seems to be a lot of hesitation for offshore enhanced oil recovery in general, but that's, in Europe, most of the storage will be offshore, so the issue hasn't really arisen. In those places, the new projects are designed to be saline aquifer projects. But right now, yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Hello?
Yes.
Okay. Can I ask one question?
Yes.
I'm a driller, I did some reservoir many years ago, but from a practical perspective and CO2 and say secondary or tertiary recovery, doesn't it make sense to inject CO2 and produce, heavy, high viscosity oil and get something positive out so that you're taking care of the bad stuff, the CO2, and pumping it under the ground and getting oil and gas out as production?
Yes.
I mean, everybody talks about just like a one-way trip, like injection, whether it be water or nitrogen or whatnot. But nobody's talking about bringing the dead back to life, like dead oil. Mm. Am I off track or something like that? Yeah.
No, I don't think, again, over 90% of CO2 storage is producing oil. It's all in the U.S. I was just at the SPE ATC meeting in October in Houston. There's a huge amount of enthuson for CO2 storage, but with enhanced oil recovery.
Free money from...
Absolutely. So, again, it's really, in America, the regulations permit it, and the infrastructure know-how is there. Whether it happens outside of America,
God knows.
comes down to whether the regulations allow it and whether people are willing to take the risk and develop projects that essentially don't have as much experience with.
Right. But in other countries where they have heavy oil, are they not thinking about this without all these, tax deductions and subsidies and whatnot? I mean, CO2 is CO2 and secondary and tertiary is what it always has been. It's sort of like rediscovered, right?
I think that there are probably a number of folks in this room that could comment on that, especially in this region. The answer I know is yes, they absolutely are. But again, some of the barrier is a lot of the barrier outside of America is experience and risk with things like offshore enhanced oil recovery. It's so it's not something that there are very few. I think there's maybe one offshore enhanced gas injection project operating right now, maybe two. Wow. So there's very little experience with it.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay, let me push the point. Okay, I got it.
So
it's incredible, this is like old stuff. Like I'm 100 years old myself, but we were talking about this a long time ago.
Yeah,
but still, nothing much has changed.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think there are a few kind of fundamentals that people should keep in mind. Is if carbon dioxide storage incentives are around $50 per ton now, looks like they're going up to around 150 to 180 in North America. If you store a ton of carbon dioxide and you produce 3 barrels of oil, and probably you could produce more, and you're getting $50 for every barrel,
of course,
you're already outstripping the incentive from the storage.
It's like free money, right?
Yeah, I mean, so it's not that simple, but yeah. So, I mean, I did want to say with the questions, it would be great to hear from some students, so as well. But you don't have to be. And we've got a question up at the front. But if any students want to,
that's what I'm about to ask.
Yeah,
All right,
that'd be great.
question from student.
Yeah, I want to ask about like the heterogeneity from your model, because I'm thinking about in the actual condition of the heterogeneity. So does the model will consider the heterogeneity effect that when you inject the CO2 will affect to the like a reaction to the heterogeneity of the mineral in the core? Because when I saw your presentation, I mean, mostly it's talk about like the pathway of the CO2 gonna flow, but what will be the reaction in the actual condition when you have heterogeneity in your core? It will be react to the CO2. So that one consider in your model. That's it.
Yeah, that question hasn't been touched. So subsurface mineral reactions are very difficult to characterize, very difficult to model, and then combined with the impacts on flow of heterogeneity, if the impacts will be complicated and at the moment unpredictable. So it's a great area for research and development, but we haven't yet touched that one. So, and as far as I know, nobody has.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's about it for the question and answer. Oh, one? Okay. This will be the last one.
Thank you very much for the nice presentation. Whenever the talk of simulation comes up, because I'm from a seismic background, so always computation comes in my mind. Now, heterogeneity has different scales, right? And you are showing that you are going into a centimeter level heterogeneity scale. What will be the cost of computation when we are taking into account this kind of very small scale heterogeneity and projecting into a field level scale? Is it going to be very expensive to simulate it? Or is it like you are taking it in a small scale and just extrapolating it in a field level?
Yep. So that's probably the most common question I get about this research, and we've had practicalities in mind from the beginning. And in this case, we've looked for opportunities to be pragmatic. In this case, the important thing isn't the characterization at centimeter scale, but knowing that the impacts are important to account for at the field scale. And so, for example, one of the ways we include that impact are with certain forms of our relative permeability curves at the field scale. So if you don't have all of the information or you don't have the time to characterize at the centimeter scale, you can still create relative permeability curves that result in a manifestation of that flow. So that's the important thing is the physics, not is knowing that the physics are important to represent more so than the actual characterization. But of course, if you can characterize, then it's less uncertain.
Okay, thank you very much. In a sense of time, let me conclude on the Q&A sessions. So thanks very much, Dr. Samuel.
Thank you.
Thanks for bringing all this new information actually to the SPE Thailand section. It is very interesting, very difficult, and I think it's very timely, right, for Thailand because we will embark on the CO2 storage very soon. So, Kun Panit, please do the honor of the presenting our token of appreciation to the speakers this evening. Thank you very much. Okay, then do the closing as well, Kun Panit.
Okay. Right, let's continue a bit before we have a lucky draw. So to keep the momentum going, so next month topic on 16th of February gonna be on the Thailand Energy Plan toward Carbon Neutrality by Dr. Praset Sinsuk Praset, the Director General from Department of Alternative Energy Development and Efficiency. So stay tuned on that. We'll be on Thursday as well in Landmark Hotel. Next one, I believe maybe some of you saw this across your email box. This is the SPE Award. So this year we open for the nomination both in international and regional award. So you can nominate anyone you think fit for such a award or nomination. For international is by mid of next month in February, and in the regional award is by 1st of March. So basically you just need the CV of the person, some recommendation letter or any paper, any work that he did for SPE, then you can upload in the website. So the website is in www.spe.org/en/awards, right? And of course, the big event for 2023, we will have the IPTC 1st to 3rd of March in Central World this year. So now they already have the full program for this conference. If you haven't registered now, you still can register, but unfortunately the paper submission already closed. So that's what you can do now, is only register and join the event. There are other events or activities for in the region. You can check out spe.org/Asia Pacific. There are plenty of conference and workshop throughout the Asia, so for you to check it out. And let's check out our neighbor, so SPWLA. We'll have a technical presentation as well on sustaining gas potential in rainbow area by cracking from shallow pay and thin laminated using triaxial induction tools and borehole imaging. Okay, have to take some breath over there. So by Kun Kampanat from PTTEP. So this one will be held in the Jasmine City Hotel. So if you are interested, you can register in the SPWLA website. Of course, last but not least, you can connect with SPE Thailand in several ways. We have the Facebook page, we have LinkedIn group, and we have Line official. Our website is still in progress. So once it's once ready, then we will let you know. But right now you have 3 channels to reach us. So you can, if you want, you can pick up your phone and take a shot on this QR code, and then you are in. All right, next one would be lucky draw. I believe all of you know that this is a winter time in Bangkok and in Thailand. So our lucky draw today will be blanket. Probably not very cold for us, but something you use in the aircon room would be okay. And the one that gonna have a warm good night is Kun Paul from Ajereka Berhat. I'm not sure if I spell your company right.
Paul?
Mr. Paul.
Paul Jatupon, I think. Paul 1, Paul 2, Paul 3, OB. Next one.
Okay, next. So Paul missed his warmest blanket. คุณธนพัฒน์ทิติธรรมจริยาปะครับ Congratulations. Now you are ready for winter คือมันแค่ใช่ไหม
Which color you like? Great. Okay.
And he picked Mickey Mouse. Next one in line will be Pokemon, by the way. So, no, Pokemon. Pikachu. Mr. Snow from resting. What do you mean by resting? Kun Snow. Congratulations. Resting. All because you are resting. Relaxing. That's why I wonder, very interesting company name, Resting. Resting. All right, congratulations. It could be for your niece or for your nephew. All right, I believe we serve you some drink, alcohol, but if you think it's still not enough, you can continue the journey at the Rendezvous bar on the ground floor. We have 2-for-1 promotion if you say you're coming from SPE. And another round of applause for our generous sponsor for tonight. Thank you very much ครับ ขอบคุณครับ Thank you จบแล้ว
See you again, guys. It's a good rest of your week.